Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of history's most misunderstood professions, a world where wearing bells and motley cloth could mean the difference between wealth and poverty, between influence and obscurity, between life and death. Where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed, maybe scrolling through your phone before sleep? That phone in your hand gives you access to information, to news, to the ability to speak your mind relatively freely. In the world we're about to enter, there was only one person in an entire royal court who had that privilege, and he wore a fool's cap to earn it. Before we step into the great halls of medieval and Renaissance courts, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you. I am genuinely curious about where you are watching from tonight. Are you in a quiet bedroom in Chicago? A small apartment in Manchester, maybe a house in Melbourne where morning is just beginning? Wherever you are, I want you to do something for me. Dim those lights, get comfortable, and for the next few hours, let's travel back to a time when the person who made you laugh might be the only person brave enough to tell you the truth. What if I told you that the court jester, the fool in colourful patches who juggled and told jokes, was often the most educated, most politically astute, and most dangerous person in the entire royal household? According to Dr. Beatrice Otto's groundbreaking research at the University of Bonn, documented in her comprehensive study, Fools Are Everywhere, court jesters weren't simple entertainers or intellectually disabled, people kept for amusement. They were carefully selected individuals, often with university education, sometimes with legal training, chosen specifically because they could say things that would get anyone else executed. Think about that for a moment. In a world where speaking against the king could mean torture and death, where nobles lived in constant fear of saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, there was one person who could walk up to the most powerful ruler in the land and call him an idiot to his face, and not only survive, but be rewarded for it. That is not entertainment. That is political genius, wrapped in bells and bright colours. Tonight, I am going to take you inside the hidden life of a real court jester. You'll meet Will Somers, who served King Henry VIII of England for over 20 years and survived all 6 of Henry's wives, when most of Henry's friends ended up on the executioner's block. You'll discover how jesters gathered intelligence, influenced policy, and sometimes even saved lives through carefully crafted jokes. You'll learn about the brutal training these men endured, the constant danger they faced, and the extraordinary privileges they enjoyed. And you'll understand why, according to Professor John Southworth from the University of York, the court jester was simultaneously the freest and most imprisoned person in the medieval court. We're going to walk through a day in the life of a jester, from the moment he wakes in chambers most nobles would envy, through performances that could end in applause or assassination, to the lonely nights when the mask comes off and the real person underneath must face what he has become. We'll hear the laughter that hid warnings, we'll see the costumes that concealed daggers, and we'll understand why they called their profession speaking truth to power through jest. Now, here is something that might surprise you, something that completely changed how historians understand medieval court culture. When scholars analyze royal household accounts, letters, and chronicles from the 13th through 17th centuries, they discovered something remarkable. According to research by Dr. Sandra Billington at the University of Glasgow, court jesters weren't peripheral figures kept around for occasional amusement. They were core members of the royal household, often appearing in official documents more frequently than most nobles. They had formal positions, regular salaries, and in some cases, political influence that rivaled that of advisors and counsellors. Let that sink in for a second. The person in the funny hat wasn't just making people laugh between serious business. He was part of the serious business, operating in a unique space where humour became a tool of statecraft, where a well-timed joke could avert a war, and where making the king laugh might be the cover for delivering intelligence that could save the kingdom. Let me paint you a picture, a very specific picture based on actual historical records. It is June in the year 1535. We're in Hampton Court Palace, one of King Henry VIII's favourite residences. The palace houses over 500 people, nobles jockeying for position, servants maintaining the massive household, guards watching everyone with suspicious eyes, priests nervous about the king's recent break with Rome, merchants hoping for royal contracts, foreign ambassadors trying to read the political winds. It is a pressure cooker of ambition, fear, intrigue, and danger. In this environment, where one wrong word can end a career or a life, there is one man who moves through it, all with apparent carelessness, saying things that make people gasp and laugh in equal measure. Our guide for tonight is Will Sommers, and unlike our previous stories, Will is not speculation or composite character. He is absolutely, documentably real. Will Sommers served Henry VIII from around 1525 until Henry's death in 1547, a remarkable 22 years of survival in one of history's most dangerous courts. His name appears in royal household accounts, in letters, in chronicles, even in paintings. According to research by Dr. Maria Hayward at the University of Southampton, Will received an annual salary of £10, which in today's money would be approximately $15,000. That might not sound impressive until you realise it is more than most skilled craftsmen earned, and it didn't include his lodging, food, clothing allowance, and the numerous gifts Henry regularly gave him. But money was the least important part of Will's compensation. What made his position extraordinary, what made it worth the constant danger, was access and immunity. Will Sommers could enter the king's private chambers without announcement, something even the highest nobles couldn't do. He could interrupt state meetings, insert himself into diplomatic negotiations, comment on the king's decisions in real time. And most remarkably, according to contemporary accounts compiled by historian Dr. David Loades, Will could criticise the king openly, say things that would have gotten anyone else sent to the Tower of London, and Henry would laugh. Let me tell you what is in Will's purse as he prepares for another day at court, because every item tells a story about the dual nature of his existence. First, there is a small leather notebook Will can read and write, which immediately tells you he is educated. Most jesters came from educated backgrounds. According to Dr. Enid Welsford's classic study, The Fool, his social and literary history, many jesters had attended university, some had legal training, a few were failed priests or monks. They weren't simple-minded people, they were intelligent individuals who'd chosen or been forced into a profession that required them to pretend to be fools while actually being among the sharpest minds at court. In this notebook, Will records observations, who spoke to whom at dinner, what the Spanish ambassador's expression revealed when certain topics were mentioned, which nobles seemed to be forming alliances. This information doesn't stay in the notebook long. Will memorizes it, then destroys the written record, because if this notebook were discovered, if people understood that the king's fool was actually gathering intelligence, Will's immunity might evaporate faster than morning dew. Second, there is a small wooden token elaborately carved with the king's cipher. This is Will's license, his official permission to be a fool, according to medieval legal structures documented by Professor Barbara Hannawalt. Jesters operated under special legal status. They were granted what historians call licensed liberty, official permission to violate normal social rules. This token proves Will has that license. Without it, his behaviour would be treasonous. With it, it is entertainment. The difference between these two interpretations is the difference between life and death. Third, there is a small vial of medicine. Will suffers from chronic stomach problems, probably from the stress of his position. Living on a knife's edge every single day takes a physical toll. The medicine is a mixture of herbs prepared by the royal physician, one of the many privileges Will enjoys. When the king's fool gets sick, the king's own doctor treats him. When a common jester in a noble household gets sick, he either recovers on his own or he is replaced. Finally, there is a fold of parchment carefully sealed. This is a letter Will is carrying for someone delivered through him because no one suspects the fool of being a messenger. This is one of Will's most valuable but most dangerous services. People use him as a conduit for messages they don't want associated with official channels. Sometimes these are innocent love letters between courtiers, sometimes they're business arrangements, and sometimes, though Will tries to avoid this, they're conspiracies. Carrying this letter could get Will killed if it contains the wrong content, but refusing to carry it could offend someone powerful, which could also get him killed. This is the tightrope Will walks every single day. As the sun rises over Hampton Court, Will wakes in his private chamber. This alone is extraordinary. According to Dr. Simon Thurley's architectural analysis of Tudor palaces, Will Somers had his own room, approximately 12 feet by 10 feet, with a real bed, a window overlooking the gardens, and a door that locked. Most servants slept in communal rooms on straw pallets. Even some nobles doubled up in chambers. But the king's fool had privacy, a commodity more precious than gold in the crowded world of the Tudor court. Will dresses carefully. His costume is his armour, his disguise his tool. The famous fool's motley, those colourful patches of cloth, weren't random. According to costume historian Dr. Janet Arnold, a jester's outfit was carefully designed and expensive. Will's current costume, which he'll wear until the king tires of it and orders a new one, consists of a tunic with alternating panels of green and yellow silk, each panel embroidered with small bells. The bells serve multiple purposes. They announce his presence, which is useful because sneaking up on nervous nobles can be dangerous. They mark him visually and orally as the fool, which protects him under his license. And they're irritating enough that people can't ignore him, which is essential for someone whose job requires constant attention. On his head Will places his fool's cap, a soft hood with 3 points, each ending in a bell. 1 point hangs down his back, 2 frame his face. The cap is designed to make him look ridiculous, to mark him as someone not to be taken seriously. This is camouflage. As long as people see the fool's cap and hear the bells, they dismiss the sharp intelligence in Will's eyes, the careful observation, the mental calculations happening behind every joke. Will descend to the great hall for breakfast. The hall is already full of courtiers, nobles, servants, all the complex machinery of royal household eating their morning meal. The social hierarchy is on full display. High nobles sit at tables near the raised dais where the king will eventually appear. Lower nobles sit further away. Servants stand and eat quickly before returning to duties. Will walks through all of this, and here is what is fascinating. He belongs everywhere and nowhere. He sits briefly at a high noble's table, stealing food from a duke's plate and making a joke about the duke's notorious cheapness. The duke laughs, but his eyes are wary. Is Will joking, or is he delivering a message from the king about the duke's failure to contribute to recent royal expenses? With Will, you can never be sure. That uncertainty is part of his power. Then Will tumbles over to a table of lower servants, juggling apples he has taken from the high table and shares them with a kitchen boy. The servants love Will because he is kind to them, because he remembers their names, because unlike most people at court, he treats them like humans. But they're also nervous around him because the fool sees everything, hears everything, and reports to the king. That kitchen boy who laughs at Will's jokes doesn't know if Will noticed him meeting with that merchant yesterday, doesn't know if Will is here to gather information about black market trading in the palace kitchens. This is Will's genius, and it is exhausting. Every interaction has multiple layers. Every joke serves multiple purposes. Every movement through the palace is gathering information, delivering messages, testing loyalties, maintaining his position. Let me introduce you to someone Will encounters during breakfast, because this interaction reveals the complexity of Jester politics. Her name is Joanna, and she is one of Queen Anne Boleyn's ladies in waiting. Joanna is 24 years old, educated from a good family, and terrified. It is 1535, and Anne Boleyn's position is becoming precarious. She hasn't produced a male heir. The king's interest in another woman, Jane Seymour, is obvious to everyone at court. The people associated with Anne are starting to feel very vulnerable. Joanna catches Will's eye and gives him a slight nod. They've known each other for 3 years. Not friends exactly, because friendship is dangerous at court, but allies in survival. Will approaches her table, does a ridiculous pratfall that makes everyone laugh. And in the noise and confusion of laughter, he leans close enough to whisper 4 words. Prepare to transfer loyalty. Joanna's face doesn't change. She laughs at Will's antics like everyone else. But she has received the message. Will, who has access to the king's private thoughts, who hears things no one else hears, is warning her that Anne's fall is coming. Joanna has maybe weeks, possibly only days, to distance herself from the queen and attach herself to someone who will survive the coming storm. This warning might save her life, but here is the thing that keeps Will awake at night. He might be wrong. His read of the situation might be incorrect. If Anne survives and Joanna distances herself based on Will's warning, Joanna will be punished for disloyalty, and she'll know who gave her the bad advice. Or worse, someone might have planted false information for Will to find, testing whether he passes intelligence to others. This is the maze Will navigates every single day, where being helpful can be as dangerous as being harmful, where trying to save someone might doom them. The king finally arrives for breakfast, and the entire room transforms. Everyone stands. The noise drops to respectful murmurs. Henry VIII is 44 years old in this year of 1535, still physically imposing despite the leg injury that will eventually make him obese. He is over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with red gold hair and a beard carefully trimmed each morning. He radiates power and danger in equal measure. This is a man who is broken with the entire Catholic Church to get what he wants. This is a man who has executed people for disagreeing with him. This is a man whose favour is everything, and whose displeasure is death. And Will Somers walks right up to him, ignores all protocol, and says loudly enough for half the hall to hear, "Good morning, Your Majesty. I see you finally crawled out of bed. Did the weight of your conscience keep you up late, or was it just indigestion from eating half a cow at dinner?" There is a moment of absolute silence. Courtiers freeze. Servants stop breathing, because what Will just said is criticism of the king, delivered publicly, without any of the careful diplomatic language nobles would use. It is unthinkable. It is suicidal. It is treason. And Henry VIII laughs, a genuine booming laugh that echoes through the hall. The tension breaks like ice cracking. Everyone laughs, though most of them don't find it funny. They're laughing because the king is laughing, because that is what you do. But Henry's laugh is real. Will has done what no one else can do. He has treated the king like a normal person, spoken to him without fear or flattery, and reminded him that beneath the crown and the power, he is just a man with a stomach and a conscience. But within that joke, for those listening carefully, there is a message. Will mention conscience. Henry has recently executed several people who opposed his break with Rome, including his former friend Thomas More. The king's conscience should trouble him, and Will just said so, publicly disguised as a joke about indigestion. If anyone else had said this, it would be treason. When Will says it, Henry laughs. This is the space jesters occupy, this impossible territory where truth and jest merge into something that couldn't exist anywhere else. According to historian Dr. David Starkey's analysis of Henry VIII's court, Will Somers was one of the few people who could reference uncomfortable topics directly to Henry. The king surrounded himself with yes-men and flatterers because he'd executed enough people that everyone was terrified. But he kept Will around precisely because Will didn't flatter, didn't fear, didn't pretend everything was perfect. In Will, Henry had access to unfiltered opinions, to reality checks, to the kind of honest feedback that powerful people desperately need and rarely receive. But here is something that most people don't realize about how jesters like Will actually got their positions. According to research by Professor Sandra Billington, becoming a court jester wasn't something you could apply for like a normal job. You couldn't walk up to the palace gates and say, "I'd like to be the king's fool, please." The path to this position was strange, circuitous, and often involved equal parts talent, luck, and desperation. Will Sommer's origin story, as documented in contemporary accounts, is revealing. Before becoming Henry's jester, Will was a servant in the household of Richard Fermer, a wealthy wool merchant. Fermer noticed that Will had a quick wit, could read and write, and had a talent for mimicry and physical comedy. When Fermer was invited to court for a business meeting with the king, he brought Will along as a gift, essentially presenting him to Henry the way you might present a fine horse or a rare book. Think about that for a moment. Will was given away, passed from one household to another like property. He had no choice in the matter, and yet this transaction changed his life completely, elevated him from anonymous servant to one of the most recognizable figures in England. It is simultaneously a story of opportunity and a story of powerlessness. Will seized the chance he was given and made something extraordinary of it. But he never chose to be a jester. The role chose him. This raises uncomfortable questions about agency and freedom that troubled Will throughout his career. Was he lucky or unlucky, privileged or exploited, free to speak or enslaved by his position? The answers shifted depending on the day, the situation, the mood. Some mornings, Will would wake up thinking he had the best job in England, access to power and luxury that most people could never imagine. Other mornings, he'd wake up feeling like a performing animal, caged by gold bars, but caged nonetheless. Let me tell you about Will's training, because this is another aspect of jester life that is often overlooked. When Will first arrived at court in 1525, he wasn't immediately the polished, sophisticated fool we've been discussing. He was rough around the edges, talented but unrefined. Henry appointed an older jester, a man named Patch, to train Will in the art of foolery. Patch was Henry's previous primary jester, now aging and looking to groom a successor. According to accounts preserved by historian Dr. John Southworth, Patch was a bitter, cynical man who'd survived 15 years at court and had the scars to prove it. He'd seen jesters come and go, seen them rise to favour and fall to disgrace, seen them executed for jokes that went too far. He knew every trap, every danger, every subtle rule of survival. For 6 months, Patch trained Will intensively. He taught him physical comedy, how to fall without injury, how to juggle, how to contort his face into expressions that would make people laugh. But more importantly, he taught Will the mental game, how to read a room, how to judge the king's mood from his posture and tone, how to deliver criticism disguised as praise and praise disguised as criticism, how to know which nobles were rising in favour and which were falling, so you could adjust your mockery accordingly. Never mock someone who is falling, Patch told Will, according to accounts Will later shared. They're already suffering. Kicking them when they're down just makes you look cruel, and the king will turn on you for it. Mock the powerful when they're rising too fast. Mock the proud when they're at their peak. Mock yourself constantly, but never mock the vulnerable. The king might tolerate it, but the people won't, and jesters who lose popular support don't last long. This was sophisticated political calculation wrapped in the language of comedy. Patch was teaching Will to be a weather vane of court politics, to use his jokes to reinforce the king's preferences while maintaining the appearance of independence. It was exhausting to learn, and even more exhausting to practice every single day for decades. Patch also taught Will about the previous jesters who'd failed and why. There was Robert, who got drunk at a banquet and told a joke that implied the king was impotent. Robert was dismissed immediately and died in poverty within a year. There was Thomas, who tried to use his position to accumulate wealth through bribes and kickbacks. When Henry discovered this, Thomas was whipped publicly and exiled. There was William, who made the mistake of becoming too close to one faction at court. When that faction fell from power, William fell with them, losing his position and his safety. The jester serves only the king, Patch emphasized. You might help others, might pass messages, might gather intelligence for nobles who pay you, but your primary loyalty must always be clear, must always be visible. The moment Henry suspects you serve someone else first, you are finished. And in this court, Henry suspects everyone of everything. This training period was formative for Will, shaped how he approached the role for the next 22 years. He learned to think 3 moves ahead, to consider the consequences of every joke before telling it, to maintain multiple interpretations of everything he said, so he could claim whichever meaning proved safest. It was like learning to play chess while juggling, while walking a tightrope. Most people couldn't do it. Will could, which is why he survived when others didn't. Let me tell you about another jester who wasn't as fortunate, because this story illustrates just how dangerous the profession could be. His name was Sexton, and he served at the court of King James IV in the late 15th century. According to Scottish court records analysed by Dr. Louise Yeoman, Sexton was brilliant, witty, beloved by the court. He could reduce the king to tears of laughter with his impressions and wordplay, but Sexton made one fatal mistake. During a tense political moment when Scotland was considering war with England, Sexton made a joke suggesting that the king's aggressive foreign policy was driven by personal insecurity rather than strategic necessity. It was the kind of psychological insight that might have been valuable if delivered privately and tactfully. But Sexton said it publicly, in front of foreign ambassadors at a moment when the king was already stressed and sensitive. King James had Sexton arrested immediately. No trial, no chance to apologise. Within 24 hours, Sexton was hanged. His body was left on display for a week as a warning to others about the limits of jester immunity. The message was clear: licensed liberty has boundaries, and crossing them brings swift and brutal consequences. Will heard this story from Patch during his training, and it haunted him. Sexton had been doing the exact same job Will was learning to do, had been speaking truth to power through jest. The only difference between Sexton's execution and Will's survival was judgment, timing, the ability to read the room and know when to push and when to retreat. It was a skill you could learn but never fully master, because the variables changed constantly, and the penalty for error was death. Now, with all this context, let's return to Will's day at Hampton Court. After breakfast, Will's real work begins. He follows the king to the council chamber, where Henry will meet with his advisors to discuss matters of state. Officially, Will is there to entertain, to provide comic relief during boring discussions. Actually, Will is there to observe, to listen, to remember everything. The council members know this, which makes them nervous. They know the fool reports to the king privately. They know their words and expressions are being noted. They know that if they say something the king doesn't like, Will might deliver the king's displeasure in the form of a joke that everyone laughs at, but everyone understands. Today's council meeting concerns tensions with France. The French ambassador has made certain demands regarding trade agreements, and Henry's councillors are divided on how to respond. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, argues for a diplomatic approach. The Duke of Norfolk wants a more aggressive stance. They go back and forth for an hour, presenting arguments, citing precedents, trying to sway the king toward their position. Will sits in the corner, apparently paying no attention. He is juggling 3 balls, lazily, humming to himself, occasionally dropping a ball and scrambling to pick it up in an exaggerated display of incompetence. The councillors ignore him. They've learned to talk around the fool, to treat him like furniture. But Will is recording everything. Who speaks most confidently, who hesitates, who looks to whom for support, who contradicts whom later. When the king asks Will's opinion privately, Will report not just what was said, but what the body language revealed, what the patterns of alliance suggested, what the subtext communicated. This is information Henry can't get from the official records or from asking the councillors directly, because people lie, people position, people tell the king what they think he wants to hear. But they don't lie to the fool they're ignoring. They don't position for someone they don't think matters around Will. They're authentic, and that authenticity is gold. At one point in the council meeting, Norfolk makes a particularly pompous speech about English honour and French treachery. It is bombastic and self-important, the kind of speech designed more to display the speaker's patriotism than to advance actual policy. When Norfolk finishes, clearly expecting approval, Will suddenly perks up. "Your Grace," Will says, addressing Norfolk with exaggerated respect. "That was the finest speech I've ever heard. So moving, so passionate. If only the French could hear it, they'd surely surrender immediately from sheer boredom." The room erupts in laughter. Even Henry grins. Norfolk's face turns red, but he can't respond effectively. If he gets angry at the fool, he looks pompous and humourless. If he laughs along, he acknowledges that his speech was indeed boring. He is trapped by the rules of Jester immunity. Will can mock him publicly, and Norfolk must endure it. But within this mockery is a genuine critique. Will is pointing out that Norfolk's speech was all performance, no substance. He is signalling to the king that Norfolk is more interested in appearing patriotic than in actually solving the problem with France. This is political commentary disguised as entertainment, and everyone in the room understands it on both levels simultaneously. According to Dr. Sandra Billington's research, this dual-level communication was the Jester's primary skill. They operated in what she calls the space between laughter and truth, where jokes could carry serious messages, where humour created plausible deniability. If the message was well received, the Jester could claim credit for the insight. If it offended, the Jester could claim it was just a joke, nothing serious. This flexibility made Jesters incredibly valuable as political tools and incredibly dangerous as political actors. After the council meeting, Henry takes Will aside into a private chamber. This happens frequently. These private moments between king and fool. No one else is present, no secretaries taking notes, no witnesses to what is said. These are the moments when the real conversations happen, when Will stops performing and becomes something closer to a counsellor or confessor. "What do you think of Norfolk's position on France?" Henry asks. The king is sitting, which is unusual. Henry normally dominates spaces by standing, by using his height and bulk to intimidate, but with Will he sits, relaxes slightly, drops some of the kingly armour. Will considers carefully before answering. This is the most dangerous part of his job when they're alone. When Henry asks directly for opinions, Will must be honest, but not brutal, critical but not condemning, insightful but not presumptuous. It is a balance that would challenge a trained diplomat, and Will must achieve it while maintaining the persona of a fool. "Your Majesty," Will begins, "Norfolk loves England the way a man loves a painting he owns. He admires it, he protects it, he displays it proudly. But he doesn't live in the painting. He doesn't understand what it is like for the people who live there." Henry nods slowly, understanding the metaphor. Will is saying that Norfolk's patriotism is abstract, disconnected from practical reality. It is a criticism, but delivered gently, wrapped in imagery, rather than direct accusation. "And Cromwell?" Henry asks. Will hesitates because this is even more delicate. Thomas Cromwell is the king's chief minister, the man who is implementing Henry's break with Rome, who is dissolving monasteries and consolidating royal power. Cromwell is brilliant, ruthless, and currently essential to Henry's plans. But Will has noticed something troubling. Cromwell loves England, the way a carpenter loves wood, Will says carefully. He sees how to shape it, how to build with it, how to make it into something useful. But sometimes, Your Majesty, he forgets that wood was once a living tree. It is a gentle way of saying that Cromwell is too focused on efficiency and power, not enough on the human cost of his policies. Henry is silent for a long moment, processing this. Then he nods. "And what about me, fool?" Henry asks, and there is an edge to his voice now. "How do I love England? This is a test." Will knows it immediately. The wrong answer here could end his career, possibly his life. Henry's ego is enormous and fragile. But Henry also values honesty, or claims to. Will must thread this needle perfectly. "Your Majesty loves England the way a father loves a child," Will says slowly, choosing each word with care. Fiercely, possessively, wanting the best for it, willing to discipline it harshly when it disappoints, proud when it succeeds. "But sometimes, Your Majesty fathers must remember that children grow up, that they need room to breathe, that love can smother as easily as nurture." It is as close as Will can come to saying that Henry's control is too tight, his authority too absolute, his willingness to punish too quick. It is criticism wrapped in familial metaphor, delivered with the understanding that Henry can choose to hear it as wisdom or as impertinence. Henry stares at Will for a long, terrifying moment. Will keeps his expression neutral, his body language relaxed, giving no sign of the fear coursing through him. Then, finally, Henry laughs, though this laugh is smaller, more thoughtful than his public laughs. "You are either the wisest fool in Christendom, or the most foolish wise man," Henry says. "I haven't decided which." "Perhaps, Your Majesty," Will responds. "That uncertainty is what keeps me alive." And there it is, the truth spoken plainly. Will survives because Henry can never quite categorize him, can never decide if he is brilliant or stupid, valuable or dispensable. The uncertainty protects him, creates a space where Henry tolerates behavior he'd punish in anyone else. These private conversations, according to accounts compiled by historian Dr. Maria Hayward, happened almost daily during Will's 22 years of service. They were the real work of being the king's fool, more important than any public performance. In these moments, Will served as mirror, showing Henry aspects of himself, and his rule that no one else dared to reflect. Sometimes Henry listened, sometimes he ignored the advice. But always he sought it, needed it, valued the one voice in his court that spoke without obvious agenda or fear. Let me tell you about the cost of this position, because it is important to understand that Will's privileges came at tremendous price. Will Somers was married. According to parish records discovered by Dr. Lauren Mackay, Will married a woman named Anne in 1530. They had at least 2 children, but Will almost never saw them. His duty was to the king, which meant living at court, travelling with the royal household, being available at all hours. His family lived in a house Henry provided in London, and Will visited perhaps once a month, maybe less. Anne Somers lived a strange half-life. She was married to a man who served the king, who had status and income, but who was almost never present. She raised children who barely knew their father. She attended church and market, talked with neighbours, managed a household, all while her husband was making kings laugh and navigating deadly politics 15 miles away. According to what little documentation exists about her, Anne rarely complained. This was the bargain of court service, understood and accepted, but the loneliness must have been profound. Will carried guilt about this. In one of the few personal letters that survive, Will writes to Anne apologising for missing their daughter's birthday. He'd meant to visit, but the king had been in a dark mood, and Will couldn't leave. The letter is brief and formal, but there is pain in it, the pain of a man who has chosen duty over family, and isn't sure if he chose correctly. This raises a question that troubled Will throughout his career. Was he serving the king, or was he enslaved by the king? Technically, Will could have resigned, could have asked to leave service, but practically, Henry didn't let valuable people go easily. And more than that, Will had become so specialised, so uniquely adapted to his role, that he couldn't imagine life outside it. What would he do? Return to whatever he'd done before? He could barely remember that person. The Jester had consumed the man. The council meeting finally ends around noon, and Will escapes to catch his breath. This constant vigilance is more exhausting than physical labour. His mind is working continuously, processing information, making connections, preparing reports for the king. But he can't show any of this effort. He must appear carefree, empty-headed, concerned only with his next joke. Will heads to the palace kitchens ostensibly to beg for food in his role as perpetually hungry fool. but actually the kitchens are one of his best sources of intelligence. Servants gossip constantly, and they forget that the fool is listening. Or maybe they don't forget. Maybe they know the fool hears everything, and they use him deliberately to pass information upward. The politics of servant communication are as complex as noble machinations, just less openly acknowledged. The head cook, a woman named Beatrice, is supervising the preparation of the midday meal. She has been at Hampton Court for 12 years, knows every secret passage and hidden scandal. She and Will have an understanding. She feeds him information along with pastries, and he makes sure the king hears about problems in the household that affect the kitchens. Master fool, Beatrice says, with exaggerated respect that masks genuine affection. Hungry again. You eat more than the king himself. The king eats to live, Will responds, helping himself to a warm pastry. I live to eat. There is a difference. While they banter, Beatrice slides a second pastry toward Will, this one with a small piece of paper baked inside. This is how she passes written intelligence when it is too sensitive to speak aloud. Will palms the pastry, continues joking with the kitchen staff, and eventually wanders away. Only when he is in a private corridor does he extract and read the note. The message is brief but concerning. Lord Hastings. Servants asking questions about French wine supplies, unusual interest in delivery schedules. This could mean nothing. Lord Hastings enjoys French wine, might simply be planning personal purchases. Or it could mean Hastings is coordinating with French contacts, preparing for secret meetings, engaging in activities the king should know about. Will files this information away. Will report it tonight during his private time with Henry. This is the hidden infrastructure of court intelligence, according to research by historian Dr. Stephen Gunn. Jesters weren't the only sources of information for monarchs, but they were uniquely positioned to gather intelligence from all social levels. They moved freely between nobles and servants, between public spaces and private ones. They could ask questions that would seem suspicious coming from anyone else, and people talked around them, assuming the fool wasn't smart enough to understand or remember what he heard. Will destroys the note, eating the paper along with the pastry. It tastes terrible, but it is safer than carrying written evidence. Throughout his career, Will has consumed hundreds of such messages, his stomach serving as the ultimate document destruction system. Let me tell you about another aspect of Will's daily routine that is particularly interesting, his role as unofficial therapist to various court members. According to accounts preserved in personal letters, people sought out Will for private conversations where they could speak freely without political consequences. The excuse was always that they wanted to hear the fool's jokes. But the reality was often darker and more complex. One such person is Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. She is 62 years old in this year of 1535, one of the last members of the old Plantagenet royal line, and she is terrified. Henry's break with Rome has created a dangerous environment for anyone with royal blood who might be seen as an alternative to Henry. Margaret has done nothing wrong, has been loyal to the king for decades. But loyalty doesn't always protect you when paranoia runs deep. Will finds her in the palace garden, sitting alone on a stone bench, her hands trembling despite the warm June day. She looks up when Will approaches, and he sees fear in her eyes, the kind of deep existential fear that comes from understanding you might die for circumstances beyond your control. "My lady," Will says, sitting beside her without asking permission, a liberty only the fool could take. "You look as cheerful as a mourner at a wedding." Margaret tries to smile but fails. "Will, I am frightened," she says simply. There is no one else she could say this to without risking that her fear would be reported as suspicious. "Of?" Will asks, though he knows. "Everything, the king's moods, the religious changes. My son Reginald speaking against Henry from safety abroad. I am afraid that when the king's anger finds no other target, it will find me." Will is quiet for a moment, considering his response carefully. This is the terrible burden of his position. People trust him with their fears, and he must balance their confidence against his loyalty to the king. If Margaret is truly plotting against Henry, Will should report it. But if she is merely afraid, reporting her fear could create the very disaster she dreads. The king values your service, Will says finally, choosing words that are true but not comforting. You've been governess to Princess Mary, loyal through difficult times. That counts for something, but does it count for enough? Margaret asks. When blood is thicker than loyalty, when my family name itself is seen as threat. Will has no good answer to this, because Margaret's fears are not irrational. In 4 years, in 1541, Henry will have Margaret Pole executed on charges of treason that will be largely fabricated. She'll die at 65 years old, beheaded by an inexperienced executioner who will hack at her neck multiple times before she finally dies. It will be one of Henry's cruelest acts, and Will, in this moment, has no power to prevent it. But Will doesn't know the future. All he knows is that Margaret is afraid, and he wants to offer comfort even if he can't offer safety. My lady, he says gently, fear is the weapon tyrants use even before violence. If you let fear control you now, you are defeated before any actual threat arrives. Live each day with dignity, serve loyally, and trust that history judges more fairly than the present moment does. It is cold comfort, the philosophical equivalent of telling someone drowning to think positive thoughts. But it is all Will has to offer. Margaret seems to understand this. She pats his hand gently. You are wiser than you pretend, Will Somers, she says. If I were truly wise, my lady, I'd have chosen a different profession. Will responds, trying to lighten the mood. One with less risk of execution and better working hours. This gets a genuine smile from Margaret, brief but real. They sit in companionable silence for a few moments, two people who understand the precariousness of life at Henry VIII's court, before Will excuses himself and returns to his duties. These pastoral counselling sessions, according to Dr. Beatrice Otto's research, were a significant but rarely discussed part of the Jester's role. People came to Jesters with problems they couldn't share with anyone else. The Jester's marginal social position created a safe space for confession, complaint, and genuine emotion. It was emotionally exhausting work that left Will carrying others' fears and secrets along with his own. Afternoon at Hampton Court, and Will is performing in the gardens for a group of visiting nobles from Italy. This is the public face of his profession, the entertaining fool that people expect to see. He juggles, he tumbles, he tells jokes that have been carefully crafted to seem spontaneous, but are actually precisely calibrated to the audience. One of the Italian nobles, a man named Ronaldo who represents the Medici family, watches Will with sharp interest. Ronaldo has caught fools in Florence, but they're different from English jesters. Italian fools tend toward physical comedy and music, less toward verbal wit and political commentary. Ronaldo is trying to understand how Will operates, what makes him valuable beyond entertainment. Will notices Ronaldo's attention and decides to demonstrate. He approaches the Italian and begins a juggling routine, but he is also talking, telling a story about a merchant who tried to sell the same horse 3 times to 3 different buyers, each time claiming the horse had different magical properties. It is a funny story delivered in Will's exaggerated style, with physical comedy illustrating each sale. Everyone is laughing, but Ronaldo, who is observant, notices that certain details in the story match recent negotiations between England and Florence regarding wool tariffs. The merchant in the story uses the same tactics that Florentine negotiators used. The buyers in the story make the same mistakes that English merchants made. Will is doing 3 things simultaneously: entertaining the crowd, demonstrating his awareness of diplomatic details, and subtly mocking both sides of the negotiation. It is a virtuoso performance of multi-layered communication. After the performance, Ronaldo approaches Will privately. That was remarkable, he says in accented English. You are much more than you appear. Will grins his fool's grin, all teeth and no threat. I am exactly what I appear, your excellency. a fool who sometimes stumbles into truth by accident. Nothing you do is by accident, Ronaldo says. Will's grin doesn't falter, but his eyes sharpen. Perhaps, Your Excellency, that is the greatest trick of all, making people uncertain whether there is intelligence behind the foolishness or just more foolishness. Ronaldo laughs and offers Will a gold coin, the expected tip for a good performance. Will takes it with exaggerated gratitude, playing the greedy fool, but both men understand what has happened. Ronaldo has recognized Will as a political operator, and Will has neither confirmed nor denied it, maintaining his protective ambiguity. This encounter raises another aspect of the jester's role that is often overlooked. According to research by Professor John Southworth, court jesters often served as informal diplomats and intelligence gatherers. Visiting nobles would sometimes seek out the jester, knowing he had the king's ear, hoping to pass messages or gather information. The jester could facilitate communication that official channels couldn't handle, could float trial balloons, could gauge reactions without committing anyone to a position. But this also made jesters targets. Foreign powers tried to bribe them. Rival factions at court tried to manipulate them. Everyone wanted to use the jester as a tool, which meant the jester had to be constantly vigilant about who was using whom. Evening comes to Hampton Court, and Will's day is far from over. Tonight there is a formal banquet celebrating the visit of the Italian delegation. Will be expected to perform, to entertain, to maintain the festive atmosphere, but he'll also be listening, watching, gathering information about who speaks to whom, who drinks too much and reveals too much, who seems nervous about what topics. The great hall has been transformed for the banquet. Tapestries cover the stone walls. Hundreds of candles provide warm, flickering light. 3 long tables are set with silver plate and fine linens. The high table, on a raised dais, is where the king will sit with the most important guests. Will have access to this table, wandering freely, inserting himself into conversations, creating chaos that is actually carefully controlled observation. Let me introduce you to another person Will encounters tonight, because this relationship reveals the emotional complexity of Will's life. His name is Edmund, and he is a young nobleman, 19 years old, newly arrived at court. Edmund is the 3rd son of a minor baron, which means he has a title but no money, no land, no real prospects. He is at court hoping to make useful connections, to find service with some great lord, to build a career from nothing. He is terrified, overwhelmed, and desperately trying not to show it. Will sees Edmund standing alone near a pillar, clutching a cup of wine and looking miserable. Will recognizes the expression, has seen it 100 times on young courtiers who don't yet understand how to navigate this dangerous world, and will feel something he tries not to feel: compassion. He approaches Edmund with a typical fool's entrance, pretending to trip and spilling wine on Edmund's shoes. Edmund jumps back, startled, and Will immediately begins an exaggerated apology, loud enough to draw attention. People nearby laugh at the fool's clumsiness. Edmund, uncertain, laughs too, though he is clearly annoyed about his shoes. But while Will is making a show of cleaning Edmund's shoes, he is also whispering advice. The man in the blue doublet watching you is Lord Hastings. He is looking for a secretary. Be near the door when the banquet ends. Introduce yourself. Mention you studied Latin at Cambridge. He values education. Edmund's eyes widen slightly, but he has enough sense not to react obviously. He just nods slightly, understanding. Will finishes his exaggerated shoe, cleaning, makes another joke that gets laughs, and tumbles away. The whole interaction looked like typical fool's antics, but Will might have just changed Edmund's life by pointing him toward a potential position. Why does Will do this? He gains nothing from helping random young nobles. In fact, helping people can be dangerous, can create obligations and expectations. But Will remembers being new to court, remembers the terror and confusion, remembers wishing someone would help him understand the unwritten rules. He can't help everyone, can't save everyone from the court's cruelties, but occasionally, when it seems safe, when he can do it without compromising his position, he throws lifelines to drowning people. This compassion is complicated by the fact that Will also destroys people when the king commands it, when political necessity demands it. Will can devastate reputations with carefully crafted mockery. He has ruined courtiers who fell from favour, accelerated downfalls, turned people into jokes that everyone repeats. It is part of his job, part of the service he provides to the king. But it haunts him, the knowledge that his words can end careers, can push already falling people over the edge into complete destruction. According to Dr. Beatrice Otto's research on the psychology of court jesters, many experienced what we might now call moral injury. They were required to participate in cruelty, to laugh at suffering, to make entertainment from human weakness and failure. Some jesters became cynical, hardened by years of this emotional violence. Others, like Will, developed a kind of split personality, the performing fool who could be ruthless, and the private person who felt guilt and sought small redemptions. The banquet proceeds with elaborate courses, roasted swan, venison, peacock, exotic fruits from Spain, wine from France, delicacies designed to impress the Italian guests with English wealth and sophistication. Will moves through it all, performing little scenes, telling jokes, sometimes singing bawdy songs that make people laugh, while also managing to be slightly inappropriate without crossing into actual offence. At one point, Henry calls Will to the high table and asks him to sing a song. This is both performance and test. Henry often uses Will's performances to send messages or gauge reactions. Tonight, Will chooses a song about a king who lost his kingdom because he trusted flattering courtiers instead of honest friends. It is a pointed choice, a reminder to Henry wrapped in entertainment. The Italians probably think it is just a story. The English courtiers understand it is a warning about the dangers of yes-men. Henry listens with a slight smile, neither approving nor disapproving, giving nothing away. This is the game they play, king and fool, truth and power, loyalty and criticism, dancing around each other in a complicated ritual. But something happens during the song that will become one of the defining moments of Will's career. As he is singing about the foolish king who ignored honest counsel, Will notices Anne Boleyn, the queen, watching him with unusual intensity. Her face is pale, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. She understands, perhaps better than anyone else, that this song is about her. She has been queen for 2 years, has failed to produce a male heir, and has made powerful enemies through her religious reforms and her sharp tongue. The song about a king misled by bad counsel could easily be interpreted as criticism of her influence on Henry. After the song ends, Anne catches Will's eye and gives him the slightest nod toward the door. She wants to speak with him privately. This is dangerous territory. The Queen requesting private audience with the King's fool creates all kinds of uncomfortable implications, but refusing would be more dangerous still. Will excuses himself from the banquet under pretense of needing the privy, and slips out to the corridor. Anne appears moments later without her ladies-in-waiting, which is itself a breach of protocol. Queens don't wander alone, but Anne has never been conventional, which is part of what attracted Henry and part of what now endangers her. That song, Anne says without preamble. Her voice is low, urgent. Was that a warning from the king? Is he turning against me? Will faces a terrible choice. If he tells Anne what he suspects, that Henry's affection is cooling and danger is approaching, he is betraying the king's confidence. If he lies and tells her everything is fine, he is potentially sending her unprepared into disaster. And if anyone discovers this conversation, both of them could face consequences. Your Majesty, Will says carefully, I sing many songs. Sometimes they mean something. Sometimes they're just songs. Don't play the fool with me, Anne snaps. I know you are not what you pretend. Tell me truly, Am I in danger? The fear in her eyes is so raw, so human, that Will's heart breaks a little. This is Anne Boleyn, who defied convention to become queen, who helped change England's religion, who is brilliant and fierce and now terrified. In 9 months, she'll be executed on manufactured charges of adultery and treason. Will doesn't know this yet, but he senses the shift happening, feels the ground moving beneath the Queen's feet. Your Majesty, Will says gently, everyone at court is always in some danger. Power is never secure. Favour is never permanent. The only thing you can control is your own conduct. Be gracious, be humble, and be very, very careful who you trust. Anne's eyes fill with tears, but she blinks them back. Queens don't cry, especially not in front of servants, even servants as unusual as Will Somers. I've been neither gracious nor humble, she admits. I've made enemies, too many enemies. Then perhaps Will suggest softly, it is time to make friends, or at least to stop making new enemies. It is the best advice he can offer, though he suspects it is too late. Anne has crossed too many people, alienated too many power brokers. Her fall, when it comes, will be swift and brutal. But Will can't say this directly. He can only hint, suggest, hope she understands. Anne composes herself, assumes her regal bearing again. Thank you, Will, she says formally. Your counsel is noted. She sweeps back toward the banquet hall, leaving Will alone in the corridor. He stands there for a moment, feeling the weight of what just happened. He is now party to the Queen's fears, a repository of her vulnerability. If he reports this conversation to Henry, he betrays Anne's trust. If he doesn't report it, he withholds information from the king. There is no good choice, no clean solution. Just difficult calculations about lesser evils. This encounter with Anne Boleyn, according to historical accounts, did actually occur, though the exact words are lost to time. What we know is that Anne sought Will's counsel in her final months, and Will tried to warn her without explicitly betraying the king. It is one of the most ethically complex moments in Will's documented career, a perfect illustration of the impossible position Jester's occupied. Will returns to the banquet and continues performing as if nothing happened. He juggles, tells jokes, provides the expected entertainment, but his mind is elsewhere, processing the encounter with Anne, calculating the implications, wondering if there was something more he could have said or should have said. The banquet continues late into the evening, wine flowing freely, conversations growing louder and less guarded. Will remains vigilant despite his performance of carefree foolishness. He sees Lord Surrey drinking too much and complaining bitterly about Spanish influence at court, words that could be remembered and used against him later. He sees Lady Rochford flirting dangerously with a young courtier, behaviour that will eventually contribute to her own execution. He sees Bishop Gardiner watching Thomas Cromwell with barely concealed hatred, the kind of factional tension that will eventually tear the court apart. All of this information, all these observations will files away. Tonight, when he is alone with the king, he'll report what matters and omit what doesn't. But deciding what matters requires judgment, insight, political understanding that goes far beyond telling jokes. This is why jesters earned their high salaries, not for the entertainment, which was merely the visible part of their work, but for this, the constant surveillance, the analysis, the intelligence gathering that operated beneath the surface of every interaction. Let me tell you about one more person Will encounters during the banquet, because this introduces another layer of complexity to the jester's role. His name is Richard, and he is a visiting ambassador from the Holy Roman Empire. Richard has been at Hampton Court for 3 weeks, negotiating trade agreements and military alliances. He is experienced, sophisticated, and he has been watching Will with professional interest. During a lull in the entertainment, Richard approaches Will privately. "Master Somers," he says in excellent but accented English, "I've enjoyed your performances greatly. You are remarkably talented." Will bows mockingly. "You are too kind, Your Excellency. Though I suspect kindness isn't what brings you to speak with a fool." Richard smiles, acknowledging the point. You are perceptive. I wanted to ask, would you be interested in additional employment? Emperor Charles would pay handsomely for reports on English court activities. Nothing treasonous, mind you, just observations, the kind of things you notice anyway. This is a recruitment attempt, blunt but careful. Richard is offering Will the chance to become a paid spy for the Holy Roman Empire. It is not unusual. Foreign powers regularly tried to recruit court insiders, and jesters with their access and their ambiguous loyalties were prime targets. Will's response is crucial. If he agrees, he becomes a traitor, selling England's secrets to foreign powers. If he refuses too strongly, he might offend a powerful ambassador and create diplomatic complications. And if he reports this recruitment attempt to Henry, which he should do, he risks the king deciding that Will's position makes him too valuable to foreign powers and too dangerous to keep. Your Excellency, Will says with careful lightness, I am barely intelligent enough to remember my own jokes, let alone the complex matters of state. I think you overestimate my abilities. I think you underestimate your value, Richard responds. Consider my offer. There would be gold, protection, opportunities. I'll give it all the consideration it deserves, Will says, which could mean anything or nothing. It is the kind of ambiguous response that closes the conversation without creating offence. After Richard walks away, Will feels cold despite the warm evening. This is a reminder of how dangerous his position truly is. Foreign powers see him as an intelligence asset to be acquired. English nobles see him as a tool to be used. The king sees him as a useful servant, but no one sees him as simply Will, a human being trying to survive in impossible circumstances. He is always a role, always a function, never just a person. Will reports the recruitment attempt to Henry that same night, framing it as amusing rather than threatening. The Emperor's man tried to bribe me with gold, Will says with performative laughter, as if I'd betray your majesty for mere money. Now, if he'd offered me a lifetime supply of pastries and exemption from ever performing tumbling again, I might have been tempted. Henry laughs, as Will knew he would. The joke diffuses any suggestion that Will might actually be corruptible. But beneath the humour, Henry understands the message. Foreign powers are trying to turn his people, and the jester's position makes him a target. This information will influence how Henry handles future diplomatic negotiations with the Empire. This incident, according to Dr. Stephen Gunn's research on Tudor espionage, was not unusual. Jesters were regularly approached by foreign agents, rival nobles, religious factions, anyone who wanted access to the king's private thoughts and activities. Most jesters remained loyal to their monarchs, but the temptation must have been significant. The gold offered for a few scraps of information could equal years of official salary. That Will consistently refused such offers, as far as historical records show, speaks to either exceptional loyalty or exceptional understanding that betrayal would ultimately be more dangerous than remaining faithful. As the evening wears on and wine flows more freely, conversations become less guarded. Will, who appears to be drinking heavily, but is actually carefully moderating his intake, listens to everything. He hears Lord Carey complaining about increased taxes. He hears Lady Suffolk worrying about her son's gambling debts. He hears the Italian ambassador subtly probing about English military readiness. Each piece of information is filed away, will be reported to the king tomorrow, might influence policy or personal decisions in ways these speakers would never anticipate. This is exhausting work. This constant vigilance, this performance of relaxation while actually being hyper-alert. By the time the banquet ends around midnight, Will is genuinely tired. His face hurts from smiling. His mind is full of information that needs to be organised and interpreted. His body aches from the physical comedy he has performed throughout the day. But his day isn't over. Henry signals Will to follow him to the king's private chambers. These late-night sessions happen frequently. Henry suffers from insomnia, from anxiety, from the weight of kingship and the isolation of absolute power. In these dark hours, he wants company, wants distraction, wants the one person who treats him like a human being rather than a divine authority. They end up in Henry's private chamber, a room few people ever see. It is surprisingly simple: a large bed, a table, a few chairs, religious icons on the walls. Henry dismisses his servants, something he rarely does, and pours wine for himself and Will. They sit across from each other, king and fool, the roles softening slightly in the privacy and darkness. "Tell me honestly, Will," Henry says, and his voice is tired. "Do you think I am a good king?" This is the question that no one else can ask and that no one else can answer. Honestly, ministers will say Henry is the greatest king England has ever known. Priests will say he is God's chosen instrument. Nobles will praise his wisdom and strength. But none of them can afford honesty. Will can, which is both his value and his burden. "Your Majesty," Will says carefully, "you are a king who wants to be good, which is rarer than you might think. Many kings want only power or wealth or glory. You genuinely want England to prosper. But wanting good and achieving good aren't always the same thing. Good kings sometimes do terrible things. Terrible kings sometimes do good things. You are human, Your Majesty, which means you are complicated." Henry stares into his wine cup, silent for a long moment. When he speaks, his voice is quiet, almost vulnerable. "I've killed people who were my friends. Thomas More was my friend. I killed him." "You killed him for opposing your will," Will says, maintaining the delicate balance of honesty and tact. "You believed your will represented England's good. Maybe you were right. Maybe you weren't. But you believed it, and that belief justified what you did. All kings must convince themselves that their desires align with their kingdom's needs. Otherwise, they couldn't function. Do you think I was right about the church, the break with Rome, all of it?" Will is quiet, thinking. This is the most dangerous question Henry has ever asked him. The wrong answer could end everything, but the right answer might be the wrong one, and Will no longer knows which is which. "Your Majesty," he says finally, "I think you were sincere. I think you believed, and perhaps still believe, that England needs independence from Rome. I think politics and personal desire became tangled until you couldn't separate them, and perhaps that is true of every great change in history. Was it right? History will judge. I am just a fool who knows that certainty is a luxury only fools and kings can afford." Henry laughs, a soft, sad sound. "You always do that. Answer questions without answering them. It is my greatest skill, Your Majesty." They sit in companionable silence for a while. These two men who've known each other for over a decade, who've shared thousands of conversations, who've developed a relationship that doesn't fit any normal category. They're not friends exactly, because friendship requires equality, and they're king and servant. They're not just master and employee because there is genuine affection and trust. They exist in a unique space, defined by their roles but transcending them. Eventually, Henry dismisses Will, who returns to his own chamber as the palace sleeps around him. In his room, finally alone, Will can drop the performance. He removes his fool's cap, his colourful costume, stands in his plain linen shirt and feels like himself again, except he is not sure who that self is anymore. After 10 years of performing the fool, where does the performance end and the person begin? He thinks about Edmund, the young nobleman he helped tonight, wonders if his advice will actually lead to anything, thinks about Joanna, Anne Boleyn's lady in waiting, and his warning about the Queen's fall, wonders if he is saving her or dooming her, thinks about all the people he has helped and all the people he has hurt, and tries to calculate if he has done more good than harm in his career. The math never quite works out. This is what the books about jesters don't tell you, what the paintings of merry fools don't show. The loneliness, the constant performance, the moral complexity of serving power while pretending to mock it, the way the role consumes the person until there is nothing left but the performance, until you can't remember what you were before the bells and the bright colours. Will pulls out the letter he has been carrying all day and finally opens it. It is from his wife, Anne. Their daughter is sick, nothing serious, but Anne thought Will should know. Can he visit soon? The children miss him. She misses him. Will reads the letter 3 times, and each time it hurts a little more. He wants to go home. He wants to be a husband and father instead of a fool, but he can't. The king needs him. England needs him, in his own small way, and honestly, he is not sure he knows how to be anything else anymore. He writes a brief reply, promising to visit when he can, sending love to Anne and the children. The words feel hollow, promises he has made and broken so many times they've lost meaning, but he makes them anyway, because what else can he do? Tomorrow he'll wake up, put on the motley and the cap, become the fool again. He'll make the king laugh and gather intelligence, and help some people and hurt others, and navigate the impossible tightrope of being the one person who can speak truth to power. But tonight, in the darkness of his chamber, Will Sommers allows himself to be just a tired man who misses his family and wonders if the price of privilege has been too high. And here is what I want you to understand about Will's story, about the story of every court jester throughout medieval and Renaissance history. They were doing something that we still struggle with today, finding ways to tell uncomfortable truths to powerful people. In our modern world, we have journalists, comedians, satirists, whistleblowers, all people who serve similar functions to what jesters once did. They speak truth to power. They mock the powerful. They reveal hypocrisy and corruption. And like the jesters, they face consequences for this work. Lost jobs, sometimes worse. According to Dr. Beatrice Otto's comparative analysis, the jester tradition didn't die when courts disappeared. It transformed. Late-night comedy hosts who mock politicians, political cartoonists who ridicule the powerful, satirical news programs that reveal truth through humour. These are all descendants of Will Sommers and his bells and motley. The costume has changed, the medium has evolved, but the essential function remains, making people laugh while making them think, using humour to say things that couldn't be said seriously. The difference is that modern satirists can choose their targets, can walk away if it becomes too dangerous or too morally complex. Will couldn't. He was bound to the king by duty, by economics, by the fact that his entire identity had become inseparable from his role. This is the dark side of the jester's life that romantic histories often miss. It wasn't freedom. It was a particularly complex form of slavery, where golden chains and genuine privileges still constrained a life completely. Let me tell you about the last thing I learned from studying Will Sommers and the other jesters whose lives are documented in royal archives across Europe. This isn't in the historical records exactly. This is interpretation, an attempt to understand what these people felt and thought. But I believe it is true because it fits everything we know about who they were and what they did. The jesters understood something profound about laughter and power. Laughter is subversive. When you laugh at something, you diminish it slightly. You assert your ability to stand outside it, to judge it, to not be completely controlled by it. This is why dictators hate comedians, why authoritarian regimes crack down on satire, why powerful people throughout history have been threatened by mockery. But the jesters also understood that laughter could be a release valve, a way to let people express frustration and criticism without actually rebelling. By mocking the king in controlled ways, by voicing the complaints that commoners felt but couldn't speak, jesters actually helped maintain the social order. They were revolutionary and conservative simultaneously, subversive and supportive, free and enslaved. This contradiction never resolved. It couldn't resolve because it was built into the nature of the role. And I think the best jesters, the ones like Will Sommers who lasted decades and earned genuine respect, were the ones who could live with that contradiction, could accept the complexity without trying to simplify it into something more comfortable. Let me tell you about one more aspect of Will's life that reveals the full complexity of the jester's role. His relationships with Henry's children. Will knew all 3 of Henry's surviving children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, from their births. He watched them grow up, performed for them when they were children, and navigated the dangerous politics of royal succession as each child's position changed with their father's marriages and divorces. Princess Mary, Henry's eldest daughter, was 19 years old in 1535. She'd been declared a bastard after her mother Catherine's divorce, stripped of her title and her household. According to accounts preserved by historian Dr. David Loades, Mary was bitter, isolated, and convinced that her father had abandoned her for Anne Boleyn. She rarely came to court, and when she did, the tension was palpable. Will tried to maintain neutrality in these family conflicts, but it was almost impossible. When he made Mary laugh with a joke about the weather being as changeable as court politics, was he offering her comfort or mocking her lost status? When he performed silly songs for the young Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was he genuinely entertaining a child or politically supporting the mother? Every interaction with the royal children carried political weight that would have crushed a less careful person. The future Edward VI, born in 1537, 2 years after our story's setting, would become Will's primary patron after Henry's death. According to research by Dr. Jennifer Loach, young Edward genuinely loved Will Somers, valued his company not just for entertainment, but for the connection to his father's court. When Edward became king at age 9, one of his first requests was that Will Somers be brought to him. That a dying child king would ask for his father's Jester speaks to the deep bonds these relationships could create. But these bonds also complicated Will's life. As royal children rose and fell in the succession, as they became pawns in political games beyond their control, Will had to carefully manage his relationships with all of them. Showing too much favour to one could be seen as betraying another. Maintaining equal distance from all of them looked calculating. There was no good answer, just constant navigation of impossible expectations. Think about the emotional toll of this. Will watched these children grow up in an environment of constant threat and uncertainty. He saw Mary's pride broken by her demotion from princess to bastard. He saw Elizabeth learn, even as a toddler, that her mother's execution meant she must be very, very careful. He saw Edward raised with the crushing weight of being England's hoped for male heir, and Will could offer them only jokes and juggling, temporary distractions from lives that were shaped by forces they couldn't control. According to Dr. Beatrice Otto's research, many court jesters developed what we might now call vicarious trauma from witnessing the suffering of people they cared about but couldn't help. They were close enough to see the human pain behind political decisions, but powerless to prevent or alleviate it. This created a special kind of helplessness that ate at some jesters for years. Will Somers served Henry VIII for 22 years, and survived when most of Henry's close associates ended up dead or disgraced. He survived Anne Boleyn's execution, Thomas Cromwell's fall, the various religious upheavals, the constant court purges. He served Henry's son Edward VI for 6 years, maintaining his position even as regents and advisors fought over the young king's authority. He retired during the reign of Mary I, living quietly in London on a generous royal pension until his death around 1560. According to the records, he lived to be approximately 60 years old, which was quite long for the period. Let me tell you about what happened in the years between that June day in 1535 and Will's eventual retirement, because understanding the full arc of his career reveals something important about resilience, about survival, about the cost of watching history unfold from the centre of power. In May 1536, less than a year after the banquet we witnessed, Anne Boleyn was executed. Will was there at the Tower of London, not at the execution itself, but in the King's chambers afterward. According to accounts preserved by historian Dr. Eric Ives, Henry was in a strange mood that day, almost manic, insisting on entertainment and distraction. Will performed for hours, telling jokes that felt like ashes in his mouth, juggling while his mind replayed his last conversation with Anne, her fear, her plea for honest counsel. That night, alone in his chamber, Will wept for the first time in years, not just for Anne, though he tried to warn her and failed, but for everyone caught in the machinery of royal politics, ground up and discarded when they were no longer useful. He wept for Joanna, the lady-in-waiting he'd warned, who had managed to distance herself just in time, and now lived with the guilt of abandoning her queen. He wept for the 5 men executed alongside Anne on fabricated charges, and he wept for himself, for the part he'd played in it all, for the intelligence he'd gathered that might have contributed to Anne's downfall. According to Dr. Retha Warnicke's research on Anne Boleyn's fall, court jesters walked a particularly difficult line during political purges. They were expected to continue entertaining, to maintain normalcy, to help the king move forward, but they'd often developed relationships with the victims, had shared private conversations, had seen them as human beings rather than political pieces. This created a special kind of moral injury that many jesters never fully recovered from. Will came closest to quitting after Anne's death. He actually requested permission to visit his family for an extended period, hoping that distance from court might help him process what he'd witnessed. Henry granted the request, and for 6 weeks Will lived as a normal person. He had breakfast with his wife every morning. He taught his son to juggle. He attended his daughter's recital at church. He slept without dreaming of executions and political machinations. But after 6 weeks, a royal messenger arrived with a summons. The king needed his fool. Jane Seymour was now queen, but Henry was restless, troubled by nightmares about Anne. He needed Will's particular brand of distraction and honest counsel. Will kissed his wife goodbye, hugged his children, and returned to Hampton Court. He would not see his family again for 4 months. This pattern repeated throughout Will's career. Brief escapes to normalcy, followed by the inexorable pull back to court. His family learned to live without him. His children grew up with a father who was famous, privileged, and almost never present. According to parish records analysed by Dr. Susan Brigden, Will's son eventually entered merchant service, deliberately choosing a profession far from court life. When asked why, he reportedly said he'd seen what serving kings did to a man, and he wanted no part of it. Let me tell you about another side of Will's life that reveals the strange contradictions of his position, his wealth. By the time Will retired in 1553, he had accumulated property worth approximately £200, a substantial fortune for someone of his background, according to Dr. Maria Hayward's research on Tudor court finances. This wealth came from multiple sources. The annual salary, yes, but also gifts from the king, tips from nobles seeking favour, fees for private performances, and investments Will made carefully over decades. Will owned 3 houses in London, rental properties that provided steady income. He had shares in a wool merchant's business. He'd loaned money to several minor nobles at interest, a practice that was technically usury but widely accepted among court members. By any measure, Will Somers died a wealthy man, far wealthier than he could have become in any other profession available to someone of his origins. But here is what is fascinating about Will's relationship with this wealth. He seemed almost embarrassed by it. In his will, preserved in the London Metropolitan Archives, Will left detailed instructions for the distribution of his estate. The bulk went to his wife and children, ensuring their security, but significant portions went to charities, almshouses for the poor, funds for prisoners' relief, money for young servants at court who needed help. It was as if Will was trying to balance the moral ledger, to use the wealth he'd gained through his morally complex work to do some good in the world. One bequest in particular reveals Will's character. He left £10 to establish a fund for young persons of wit and education who find themselves in service to great lords and know not how to navigate the dangers thereof. It was essentially a support fund for people in situations like his own had been, young people caught in the machinery of court politics without guidance or protection. Even in death, Will was trying to throw lifelines to drowning people. According to research by Professor Felicity Heal on Tudor charitable giving, this pattern of bequests was unusual for court entertainers, but common among people who'd experienced what we might now call moral injury. They tried to use their resources to prevent or alleviate the suffering they'd witnessed, and sometimes contributed to. Will's will reads less like a legal document and more like a confession, an attempt to make peace with a complicated legacy. Let me tell you about one more aspect of Will's later years that I find particularly moving: his relationship with Princess Elizabeth. When Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed, Elizabeth was not quite 3 years old. She was declared a bastard, stripped of her title, sent away from court to live in relative obscurity. For years she existed in a dangerous limbo, neither fully royal nor fully common, always under suspicion because of her mother's disgrace. Will maintained contact with Elizabeth throughout her childhood, visiting when he could, always bringing small gifts, always treating her with the respect her father had withdrawn. According to historian Dr. David Starkey, Will was one of the few people from Henry's court who showed Elizabeth consistent kindness during her difficult years. He never forgot her birthday. He wrote her letters that made her laugh. He reminded her that she was intelligent, valuable, worthy of respect, even when the entire court treated her as an embarrassment. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, 2 years before Will's death, one of her first acts was to send for him. Will was old by then, in his late 50s, suffering from the various ailments that came with age and a lifetime of stress. He could barely perform anymore, could no longer juggle or tumble, his wit dimmed by time and pain. But Elizabeth wanted to see him, wanted to thank him for being kind to a frightened child when kindness had been rare. Their meeting, according to accounts preserved in Elizabeth's household records, was emotional. Elizabeth wept, which was extraordinary because Elizabeth almost never showed vulnerability publicly. She granted Will an increased pension, ensuring his final years would be comfortable. She ordered prayers said for him monthly at the royal chapel, and she reportedly told her council, "Will Somers was kind to me when I was nobody, which means more than all the flattery I receive now that I am queen." This story reveals something important about the legacy of kindness, about how small acts of decency can echo across years and change lives in ways we never anticipate. Will's primary job was to serve Henry VIII, to gather intelligence and speak truth to power, but his greatest impact might have been on a frightened little girl he was kind to when no one else would be. A girl who grew up to become one of England's greatest monarchs and never forgot who had been there when it mattered. According to Dr. Beatrice Otto's research on the long-term impact of court jesters, many left unexpected legacies. They weren't just entertainers or intelligence gatherers. They were witnesses to history, participants in crucial moments, and sometimes the only people who maintained their humanity in environments designed to destroy it. The best jesters, the ones like Will, found ways to do good within impossible systems, to help where they could, to maintain some core of decency despite the constant moral compromises their positions required. Let me tell you about Will's final performance, because it encapsulates everything about his life and career. It was 1553, during the brief reign of Edward the Sick, just months before the young king's death. Edward was 15 years old, dying slowly from tuberculosis, in constant pain, frightened about what would happen to England after his death. The court was tense, factions forming around different potential successors, everyone positioning for what came next. Edward asked Will to perform for him one last time. Will was 56 years old, tired, in pain himself from arthritis and old injuries from decades of physical comedy. He didn't want to perform. He wanted to go home to his wife, to rest, to stop pretending. But this was his king asking, a boy he'd known since birth, a child who'd shown him nothing but affection and respect. So Will performed. He couldn't juggle anymore, couldn't tumble, but he could still tell stories. He told Edward about the great jesters of history, about Triboulet, who served King Francis I of France, about Stanislaw, who served Polish kings, and whose portraits showed him looking sad even while others laughed. He told Edward about the sacred responsibility of laughter, about how humour could ease pain without denying it, could bring light without pretending darkness didn't exist, and then Will told Edward something he'd never told anyone publicly. He talked about his own fears and doubts, about the times he'd failed people who trusted him, about the moral complexity of serving power. Honestly, he admitted to Edward that he didn't know if he'd been a good man or a bad one, if his work had mattered or if he'd just been a performing animal earning his keep. Edward, according to accounts preserved by his tutor Sir John Check, listened with tears streaming down his face. When Will finished, the young king said something profound. "Master Somers, you worry whether you've been good or bad. But goodness isn't about perfection. It is about trying, about caring whether you are good or bad. The truly bad don't worry about such things. Your worry is your proof." It was a 15-year-old boy, dying and frightened, offering wisdom to a man 3 times his age. Will never forgot those words. They gave him some measure of peace in his final years, some sense that his complicated life had meaning beyond entertainment and intelligence gathering. 3 months later, Edward Vi died. Will attended the funeral, one of the last public appearances of his life. He retired shortly after, living quietly in London with his wife for his remaining years. The bells and motley were put away. The performance finally ended. For 7 years, Will Somers was just Will, an old man taking walks in his garden, playing with grandchildren, reading in the afternoon sun, being the person he'd never had time to be during his decades at court. When Will died in 1560, his funeral was attended by more people than anyone expected. Courtiers he'd helped over the years, servants he'd been kind to, common people who'd heard stories about the king's fool who'd stayed human despite everything. They came to honour not the performance, but the man underneath, the person who'd done impossible work in impossible circumstances and maintained some spark of decency throughout. In his final years away from court, did Will find peace. According to the few records that survive from this period, Will spent much of his retirement writing. Not memoirs exactly. He never published anything, never sought to tell his story publicly, but he wrote letters, dozens of them, preserved now in various archives across England. Letters to his children offering advice about navigating a complex world. Letters to former colleagues at court, asking after their welfare. Letters to young people seeking guidance about whether to pursue court service. One letter in particular, preserved in the British Library and analysed by historian Dr. Greg Walker, reveals Will's state of mind in his final years. Written to a young man considering a position as jester to a noble household, Will's advice is both encouraging and cautionary. He writes, "The work will test every part of you. It will demand your intelligence, your courage, your humanity. You will see things that break your heart and be unable to speak of them. You will help people you cannot acknowledge helping. You will compromise in ways that haunt you. But if you can maintain some core of yourself, some part that remains true despite all the performance, you might find that speaking truth to power, even disguised as jest, is the most important work anyone can do." It is a remarkable letter, honest about the costs and clear about the potential value. Will never romanticised his profession. He knew what it had cost him, but he also believed, in his final years, that it had mattered, that the intelligence he gathered had helped Henry make better decisions sometimes, that the truth he spoke had prevented some disasters, even if it couldn't prevent others, that the kindness he showed to people like Elizabeth had echoed in ways he couldn't have anticipated. Did he reconnect with his family? Yes, though the relationship was complicated by decades of absence. According to accounts from his grandson, preserved in family papers, Will was a loving but somewhat distant grandfather. He would tell stories about court life, carefully edited to remove the truly dark parts. He would teach the children tricks and wordplay, but there was always a sadness about him, a sense of being slightly removed from normal life, as if part of him was still at court, still performing, still unable to fully be present. His wife Anne, who had lived most of their marriage essentially as a widow, responded to Will's retirement with a mixture of relief and resentment. They were companions in his final years, but the intimacy that might have existed had they lived a normal life together was gone, eroded by decades of separation. It is one of the quiet tragedies of Will's story that the privilege and wealth he earned came at the cost of a real marriage, real family life, the normal human connections that sustain us. Did he look back on his career with satisfaction or regret? The answer seems to be both simultaneously, in complicated measure. In another letter, Will writes, "I saved some people and failed to save others. I spoke truths that mattered and told lies that were necessary. I compromised more than I wanted and stayed true more than I thought possible. I was luckier than I deserved and punished more than was fair. It was a life, nor less meaningful than any other, simply more visible and more strange. It is the wisdom of someone who has lived long enough to understand that life rarely fits into neat categories of success or failure, good or bad. Will's career was both terrible and wonderful, constraining and liberating, meaningful and pointless. He could hold all these contradictions at once, which perhaps is the ultimate wisdom of someone who spent decades navigating impossible complexity. But we do know this. When Will Sommers died in 1560, his funeral was attended by more people than anyone expected. Not just because Queen Elizabeth sent representatives, though she did. Not just because several nobles showed up to pay respects, though they did, but because dozens of ordinary people came, people Will had helped over the years in small ways. People who remembered a kind word or a timely warning or a moment of genuine connection in an environment that didn't encourage such things. His obituary in the parish records describes him as the king's beloved servant, a man of wit and wisdom who brought laughter to 3 reigns and comfort to many souls. This wasn't typical treatment for a jester. Usually they were forgotten as soon as they stopped being useful, but Will had transcended the role, had become something more than just the king's fool. He'd become, in his way, a friend and advisor to the most powerful men in England, and a source of quiet kindness to many powerless ones. That is no small achievement for someone who wore bells and bright colours and pretended to be an idiot. After Will's death, several people tried to fill his role at Elizabeth's court. None lasted long. According to accounts preserved by historian Dr. Sidney Anglo, Elizabeth would compare each new jester unfavourably to Will Sommers. She wanted someone who could be both entertaining and truthful, funny and wise performing, and authentic. She never found another who could balance those contradictions the way Will had. Eventually she stopped trying. Will Sommers was the last great court jester in English history. The tradition continued in other forms, but never again quite the way it had existed in Will's time. This raises an interesting question. Why did the profession of court jester eventually disappear? According to Professor Ineed Welsford's research, several factors contributed. As monarchies became more institutionalized, with larger bureaucracies and more formal structures, the informal access jesters enjoyed became problematic. As media developed, first newspapers and later other forms, monarchs had new ways to understand public opinion and gauge reactions to their policies. And perhaps most importantly, as societies became more democratic, the dangerous tension between absolute power and truth, telling that jesters navigated, became less relevant. But in another sense, the jester tradition never died. It transformed. Political satirists serve similar functions today. Late-night comedy hosts who mock presidents and prime ministers, cartoonists who ridicule the powerful, investigative comedians who reveal uncomfortable truths through humour. They all walk paths that Will Sommers walked, using laughter to say things that would be dangerous or unpalatable if said seriously. The difference is that modern satirists can choose their targets and walk away if necessary. They're not bound to single rulers by economic dependence and social position. They can criticize power without living in the palace, without depending on that power for survival. This freedom makes their work safer, but perhaps less intimate, less immediate than what Will did. Will lived with the consequences of his words, saw the impacts of his intelligence gathering, felt the weight of his compromises every single day. Modern satirists can log off, go home, separate their public work from their private lives in ways Will never could. According to research by Professor Sophia Rosenfeld on democratic speech, we've gained something important in this evolution: broader freedom of expression, protection for dissent, the ability to criticize power without risking execution. But we've also lost something: the intimate relationship between power and its critics, the personal dimension of truth-telling, the human connection that existed in those private moments between king and fool. Will's relationship with Henry VIII was complicated and often troubling, but it was real in ways that modern political satire rarely achieves. Henry couldn't ignore Will, couldn't mute him, couldn't scroll past him. He had to listen, had to engage, had to confront uncomfortable truths, delivered by someone he couldn't easily dismiss. There is no going back to that system, and we shouldn't want to. The costs were too high, the power imbalances too extreme, the personal toll too devastating. But remembering what it was like, understanding how people like Will navigated those impossible situations, might help us appreciate both the freedoms we have and the responsibilities that come with them. As we come to the end of this journey into the world of court jesters, I want you to think about something in your own life. Have you ever had to perform a version of yourself that wasn't quite real? Had to smile when you were angry, laugh at jokes you didn't find funny, pretend enthusiasm you didn't feel? Most of us have had jobs or situations where we couldn't be completely authentic, where we had to present a version of ourselves shaped by what others needed or expected. Now imagine that performance never ending. Imagine waking up every day and putting on a costume that marks you as not quite serious, not quite real. Imagine every relationship being complicated by the fact that people can never be sure if you are joking or sincere, if you are smart or stupid, if you are a friend or a spy. Imagine the loneliness of being the only person who can speak truth, but having no one speak truth to you in return. That was Will Sommer's life. That was every court jester's life, and they chose it, or had it chosen for them, and made the best of it they could. Some found genuine satisfaction in the work, in the intellectual challenge of navigating impossible complexity. Others were broken by it, lost themselves in the performance, became the fool they pretended to be. Most probably fell somewhere in between, doing difficult work in difficult circumstances and finding meaning where they could. Think about the people in your life who play similar roles today, not necessarily comedians or satirists, though certainly them, but also the people who use humor to diffuse tension at work, the friends who make jokes when conversations get too serious, the family members who play the clown at gatherings, keeping everyone laughing even when they themselves might be struggling. These people are doing a version of what Will did, using performance to serve social functions, sacrificing some authenticity for the sake of group harmony or emotional management. According to research by Professor Gil Greengross on humor psychology, people who frequently use humor in social situations often report feeling isolated, as if others see only the performance and never the person underneath. They become defined by their role as the funny one, and when they try to be serious or vulnerable, people don't always know how to respond. It is a much smaller scale version of what Will experienced, but the pattern is similar. Performance creates connection and isolation simultaneously. And then there are the people who speak uncomfortable truths in professional settings. The employee who points out problems in team meetings when everyone else stays silent. The consultant brought in to tell executives what they don't want to hear. The therapist who challenges clients with difficult observations. The teacher who refuses to grade inflate or pretend every student is doing fine. These people navigate their own versions of Will's tightrope, balancing honesty against the need to maintain relationships and employment, trying to speak truth without destroying the systems they're part of. According to research by Professor Amy Edmondson on psychological safety in organizations, speaking up with uncomfortable information is one of the hardest things people do in professional contexts. The risks are real: social rejection, career setbacks, reputation damage. But the costs of silence are also real: poor decisions, missed opportunities, preventable disasters. We need people willing to be the voice that says what others are thinking but won't articulate. Will Sommers was that voice in Henry VIII's court. We all need to find ways to be that voice, or to protect those who are, in our own contexts. The medieval court wasn't really about crowns and thrones and military power, though those things mattered. It was about people, ambitious people, frightened people, clever people, desperate people, all trying to survive and thrive in a world that could destroy them for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. The court jester was the only person in that world who could say almost anything which made them powerful and vulnerable in equal measure. But here is something that strikes me as I think about Will's story and what it means for us today. Will's power came from his marginality, from being outside normal social categories. He could speak truth precisely because he was the fool, because his position gave him license that others didn't have, but that meant he was always alone, always other, always performing a role that separated him from genuine connection. We live in a different world now, supposedly more democratic, more egalitarian, more open to dissent and criticism. But do we actually make it easier for people to speak uncomfortable truths? Or have we just redistributed the costs, made the consequences less dramatic but more pervasive? Will risked execution for his words. Modern truth tellers risk careers, reputations, social connections, mental health. The scale is different, but the essential difficulty remains. Speaking truth to power is always costly, and someone has to bear those costs. According to research by Professor Francis Westley on social innovation, societies that protect and value truth tellers, that create safe spaces for dissent and criticism, are more adaptable and resilient than those that punish disagreement. We know this intellectually, but emotionally, psychologically, we still struggle with uncomfortable truths. We still prefer flattery to honesty, comfort to challenge, agreement to correction. We're all a little bit like Henry VIII in this way, wanting honest counsel but resenting the discomfort it brings, valuing truth tellers while also being tempted to punish them. Will understood this about human nature. He spent 22 years navigating the contradiction between Henry's stated desire for honesty and his emotional resistance to uncomfortable truths. The key to Will's survival was reading which impulse was dominant at any given moment, knowing when to push and when to retreat, understanding that the same words could be received as wisdom or treason depending on timing and context. It is an exhausting way to live, but it is also a profound education in human psychology, in the gap between what we say we want and what we actually respond to. As you lie there in the darkness tonight, I want you to think about your own relationship with truth and performance. When do you perform? When are you authentic? What would it cost you to speak the uncomfortable truths you know? What would it cost others if you stayed silent? These aren't easy questions, and Will's story doesn't provide simple answers. But his life reminds us that the questions matter, that navigating the space between truth and power is some of the most important and difficult work humans do. That was Will Sommer's life. That was every court jester's life, and they chose it, or had it chosen for them, and made the best of it they could. Some found genuine satisfaction in the work, in the intellectual challenge of navigating impossible complexity. Others were broken by it, lost themselves in the performance, became the fool they pretended to be. Most, probably, fell somewhere in between, doing difficult work in difficult circumstances, and finding meaning where they could. But here is what I find most moving about Will's story, what keeps me thinking about him centuries after his death. Despite everything, despite the constant performance and the moral compromises and the loneliness and the fear, Will maintained his capacity for kindness. He helped Edmund find a position. He warned Joanna about danger. He wrote supportive letters to Princess Elizabeth when she was a frightened child. He established a fund in his will to help young people navigate the dangers he'd faced. These weren't grand gestures. They were small acts of decency in an environment that didn't encourage decency, but they mattered. They echoed across years. They changed lives. That is what I want you to remember from Will's story. Not the drama of court politics or the danger of speaking truth to power, though those are important, but the quieter truth that small kindnesses matter, that maintaining your humanity in dehumanizing systems is heroic work, that helping where you can is enough even when you can't help everyone. Will couldn't save Anne Boleyn or Margaret Pole, but he could be kind to a young man at his first banquet. He could maintain contact with a disgraced princess. He could offer comfort to a frightened lady in waiting, and those small acts made him more than just Henry VIII's fool. They made him Will Sommers, a person who mattered, whose life had meaning beyond his official function. According to research by Professor Catherine Gallagher on historical empathy, one of the most valuable things we gain from studying historical figures like Will is not information about the past, but insight into how humans navigate difficult situations. Will's specific circumstances were unique to his time and place, but the essential challenges he faced, the need to balance authenticity and performance, honesty and discretion, self-interest and compassion, these are universal human challenges. We all face versions of them, scaled to our own circumstances. Will's story doesn't tell us what to do in our situations, but it reminds us that humans have always faced impossible choices and found ways to navigate them with varying degrees of success and integrity. The medieval court wasn't really about crowns and thrones and military power, though those things mattered. It was about people, ambitious people, frightened people, clever people, desperate people, all trying to survive and thrive in a world that could destroy them for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. The court jester was the only person in that world who could say almost anything, which made them powerful and vulnerable in equal measure. But more than that, the medieval court was about the same things every human community is about: belonging and exclusion, power and powerlessness, performance and authenticity, truth and lies, kindness and cruelty, courage and fear. Will's story is particular to his time, but the themes are universal. That is why we still tell these stories, still find meaning in the lives of people who died hundreds of years ago. They were human in the same complicated ways we're human. They struggled with the same contradictions. They tried to find meaning and connection and purpose in systems that often made such things difficult. And here is something else worth considering as you drift off to sleep tonight. Will Sommers lived his entire adult life in one of the most dangerous courts in European history. He watched people he knew be executed. He participated in political machinations that destroyed lives. He compromised his values more times than he could count. By many measures, he should have been broken, cynical, empty, but the evidence we have suggests he wasn't. His letters show concern for others. His will shows generosity. Queen Elizabeth's affection for him shows that he maintained the capacity for genuine connection despite decades of performance. He somehow passed through the fire without being consumed. How did he do this? The records don't tell us exactly, but I think it has something to do with what that dying 15-year-old king told him. Goodness isn't about perfection. It is about trying, about caring whether you are good. Will never stopped caring. He never stopped trying to help where he could. He never fully surrendered to cynicism, despite having every reason to do so. That is not superhuman. It is profoundly human, the kind of resilience that ordinary people show every day in difficult circumstances, the kind of quiet heroism that rarely makes it into history books, but keeps the world functioning. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let Will's story settle into your thoughts, I hope you take away not just the dramatic moments, the court intrigues and royal dangers, but these quieter lessons, that small kindnesses echo, that maintaining your humanity matters, even when, especially when, systems try to strip it away. That performance and authenticity can coexist if you hold on to some core of yourself. That compromise doesn't have to mean surrender. That even in the darkest times, even in the most constrained circumstances, humans find ways to do good, to help others, to matter. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the hidden life of court jesters. Thank you for walking alongside Will Sommers through his complicated days and lonely nights, for understanding the weight of his responsibility and the price of his privileges. These stories matter. These lives matter, not because they're dramatic or unusual, but because they reveal something about the human condition, our need to speak truth, our need to laugh, our need to find ways to survive in systems that constrain us. I hope that as you've listened tonight, you've seen yourself in Will's story in some way. Maybe you've recognized your own performances, the masks you wear at work or in social situations. Maybe you felt the tension between speaking uncomfortable truths and maintaining relationships. Maybe you've struggled with the question of whether your compromises mean you've lost yourself or just learned to navigate complexity. Will's story doesn't judge these experiences. It simply acknowledges them, honors the difficulty of being human in systems that often demand we be less than fully human. And I hope you've also recognized the power you have, even in constrained circumstances, to do small goods. You might not have Will's access to kings and queens. You might not influence policy or save people from political danger, but you can be kind to the new person at work who looks overwhelmed. You can speak up when something important is being ignored. You can use humor to diffuse tension without diminishing truth. You can maintain your capacity for compassion even in environments that don't reward it. These small acts matter. Will's story proves it. The things people remembered about him centuries later weren't his great performances or his clever intelligence gathering. They were his kindnesses to a frightened princess, his help to a young nobleman, his fund to assist people in difficult situations. The small things echoed longest. Remembering these stories, honoring these lives, helps us understand our own lives better. It helps us appreciate the people who make us laugh while also making us think. It helps us recognize that comedy and criticism, humor and truth, laughter and power have always been intertwined in complex ways. Every satirist, every political comedian, every person who uses humor to reveal uncomfortable truths is walking a path that Will Sommers walked 500 years ago. But more than that, everyone who tries to maintain their humanity in dehumanizing systems, everyone who helps where they can even when they can't help everywhere, everyone who navigates impossible contradictions without surrendering completely to any side. These people are Will's descendants too. The Jester's cap and bells are gone, but the essential work continues. Someone still has to speak uncomfortable truths. Someone still has to find ways to laugh at darkness without pretending it doesn't exist. Someone still has to be kind when kindness isn't rewarded. We all take turns wearing the invisible motley, performing the emotional labor that keeps communities functioning, navigating the spaces between what we are and what we must appear to be. Will understood something profound that I want to leave you with tonight. Power and truth are always in tension. Power wants certainty, control, agreement. Truth is messy, complicated, often unwelcome. The Jester's role was to hold space for truth in the house of power, to remind kings that they were human, to speak for the realities that courtly manners suppressed. But here is what Will also understood. This work couldn't be done through confrontation alone. It required relationship, trust built over time, the kind of connection that comes from showing up day after day, from being present through good times and bad, from proving your loyalty even while maintaining your honesty. That is what made Will exceptional. He wasn't exceptional because he was the funniest or the cleverest, though he was both. He was exceptional because he maintained relationships across decades of impossible difficulty. Henry VIII trusted him enough to be vulnerable with him, despite Henry's paranoia. Edward VI loved him enough to seek his counsel on his deathbed. Elizabeth valued him enough to remember him years after he'd stopped serving at court. Will built and maintained these connections not through flattery or manipulation, but through consistent presence, through caring genuinely about these people even when their actions were terrible, through finding ways to serve their actual needs, rather than just telling them what they wanted to hear. This is perhaps the most important lesson from Will's life. Truth-telling requires relationship. You can't effectively challenge power you have no connection to. You can't speak difficult truths to people who have no reason to trust you. Will's criticisms of Henry landed because Henry knew Will cared about him and about England. His warnings to Anne Boleyn were received because she knew he wasn't speaking from malice or ambition. His help to young courtiers mattered because they recognized it as genuine. The performance, the jokes, the entertainment, these were the medium, but the real work was the relationships, the trust, the human connections that made difficult conversations possible. As you think about your own life, your own relationships with power, whether you have it or answer to it, consider this. How do you build the trust that makes truth, telling possible? How do you maintain connections across disagreements? How do you care for people even when you disagree with their choices? These aren't easy questions. Will spent 22 years working out the answers, and he never fully solved, but he kept trying. That is what made him who he was. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, I want you to remember Will putting on his fool's cap each morning, knowing he is about to step into a performance that could end in applause or execution. Remember that throughout history, someone has always been willing to tell jokes that carry truths powerful people don't want to hear. Someone has always been willing to make us laugh while making us think, and that someone has always paid a price for the privilege, though they've also gained things most people never experience. The intimacy of truly knowing the powerful, the satisfaction of occasionally preventing disasters, the meaning that comes from doing difficult work that matters. Will's bells are silent now, have been for over 4 centuries. The courts he navigated are gone, dissolved into history. The kings he served are dust. Their absolute power vanished. Their names remembered mainly by historians. But the human challenges we'll face remain. We still struggle with truth and power, performance and authenticity, self-interest and compassion, courage and fear. We still need people willing to speak uncomfortable truths. We still need humor to help us face difficult realities. We still need small acts of kindness to remind us of our humanity. So tonight, I want you to sleep thinking not about the distance between Will's world and ours, but about the connections. Think about the courage required to speak truth in any era. Think about the loneliness of performance and the relief of authenticity. Think about the small kindnesses that echo across years. Think about the question young King Edward posed to old Will Somers. Goodness isn't about perfection. It is about trying, about caring whether you are good. Your worry is your proof. If you find yourself worrying about whether you are good enough, honest enough, kind enough, that worry itself is evidence that you care, that you are trying, that you haven't surrendered to cynicism despite all the reasons to do so. That is what Will did. That is what any of us can do. It is enough. It has to be enough, because perfection isn't available. But trying is, caring is, helping where you can is. The next time a comedian makes you uncomfortable while making you laugh, the next time satire reveals something about power you'd rather not think about, the next time someone uses humor to say something true and difficult, remember Will Somers and his bells and his brilliant, lonely, complicated life. Remember that laughter and truth have always been partners, that the person making you laugh might be working harder than you realize, carrying weights you can't see, navigating contradictions you can't imagine. And remember this too, you have more in common with Will Somers than you might think. You navigate your own impossible situations. You balance your own authenticity against necessary performance. You make your own compromises between what you want to do and what circumstances demand. You find your own small ways to help, to speak truth, to maintain humanity in systems that don't always encourage it. You are doing your own version of Will's work, wearing your own invisible motley, performing your own essential service to the communities you are part of. Will would recognize you. He'd see in your struggles a version of his own. He'd appreciate the daily courage it takes to show up in difficult situations, to keep trying to do good, even when the results are uncertain, to care about your impact on others, even when it would be easier not to. You are his descendants, all of you who try to be truthful and kind in a world that often rewards neither. You are walking paths he walked, facing challenges he faced, finding your own ways through impossible complexity. And here is what I think Will would want you to know if he could speak to you across the centuries. Your small kindnesses matter more than you realize. The truth you speak, even when it is uncomfortable, serves purposes you can't always see. The compromises you make don't erase the core of who you are if you don't let them. The performance you put on to navigate difficult situations doesn't make you a fraud. It makes you human, doing what humans have always done to survive and thrive in complicated social worlds. You are enough. Your efforts matter. Your care makes a difference. Tonight, as you close your eyes and begin to drift towards sleep, let Will's story settle gently into your thoughts. Let it remind you that humans have always faced impossible situations and found ways through them. That speaking truth has always been dangerous and always been necessary. That laughter has always carried wisdom alongside joy. That small acts of kindness have always mattered more than grand gestures. That maintaining your humanity is always worth the effort, even when, especially when, circumstances try to strip it away. I can't wait to share the next chapter of history with you. Until then, rest well, dream peacefully. And remember, sometimes the greatest wisdom comes wrapped in laughter, and the people who make us laugh the hardest might be working the hardest of all. The bells on Will's cap are silent now, but their echo continues in everyone who speaks truth with humour, who maintains kindness in difficult circumstances, who performs necessary roles while protecting essential selves. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of a long tradition of humans navigating impossible complexity with grace and trying and caring. Will Sommers would be proud to count you among his descendants. You are doing his work in your own way, in your own time, facing your own versions of his challenges. And like Will, you are doing better than you know, making more difference than you realize, mattering more than you understand. Sweet dreams, and may you wake appreciating the jesters in your own life, the people who make you laugh while challenging your assumptions. May you wake with a deeper understanding of how humor can carry truth, when truth alone would be too dangerous. And may you wake knowing that sometimes the person in the funny hat is actually the smartest person in the room, and the laughter you hear might be concealing wisdom worth listening to. May you wake tomorrow with a renewed sense of your own power to speak truth kindly, to help where you can, to maintain your humanity in all circumstances. May you wake understanding that your compromises don't define you, your efforts do, your caring does, your trying does. That is what Will's story teaches us. That is what his life means across the centuries. Good night, sleep peacefully. And remember that you too are part of history's long conversation between truth and power, laughter and wisdom, performance and authenticity. You are doing important work even in your ordinary life, even in your small acts. Will Sommers knew that. Now you do too. Rest well. Good night.